The day dawned dark and foreboding, with a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of every man, woman, and child in the village. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant echo of war drums. In the heart of the village, a young soldier named William stood before the makeshift pulpit, his eyes reflecting the fear and uncertainty that gripped the community. The priest, Father Thomas, raised his hands, his voice trembling as he began to speak. "Brothers and sisters, today we stand on the brink of a great conflict, a war that will test our faith and our courage. But remember this, we do not fight alone. We fight with the righteous anger of God, who has called us to defend the innocent and to vanquish evil." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of centuries of belief and tradition. For William and many others, the idea of war was not just a matter of politics or power. It was a sacred duty, a holy mission. The Church had long taught that in times of great need, God would call upon the faithful to take up arms, and now it seemed that call had come. The Christian faith, with its rich tapestry of teachings and symbols, provided a framework that could be adapted to justify almost any action. The idea that all evil was associated with Satan made it easy to demonize the enemy. After all, if the enemy was seen as an agent of the devil, then fighting them was not just a military necessity. It was a spiritual obligation. This belief was not unique to the soldiers and the village. Across Europe, from the battlefields of the Crusades to the civil wars of the 17th century, Christian leaders and soldiers alike used similar rhetoric to rally their followers. The idea of holiness and warfare was deeply rooted in Christian theology. Christians were taught to pursue holiness in every aspect of their lives, including in battle. Soldiers were not just fighting for their king or their country, they were fighting for God. Every action, every victory, and every sacrifice was seen as part of a larger, divine plan. Even death in battle was not to be feared, for it was believed that those who died in the service of God would be rewarded with eternal life in heaven. But the line between holy war and just war was often blurry. Theologians and religious leaders had long debated the conditions under which war could be considered just. One of the key principles was that the cause must be just, and the means used to achieve it must be righteous. In the heat of battle, however, these distinctions could be easily forgotten. The urgency of the moment, the fear of the unknown, and the desire for victory could all lead to a simplification of complex theological ideas. In 1649, a preacher named John Maude stood before a crowd in England, preparing them for the conquest of Ireland. His sermon was filled with biblical allusions and powerful imagery, but it barely touched on the justice of the cause. Instead, he focused on how the conquest aligned with God's will. He spoke of the cruel massacres that had taken place in Ireland, using these historical events to justify the coming war. By framing the conflict in terms of divine retribution, he was able to rally the faithful without delving too deeply into the moral and ethical questions that might arise. This was not an isolated incident. The language of holiness and justice was often used in a way that was tailored to the specific context and audience. When preaching to those who were already sympathetic to the cause, religious leaders could focus on the spiritual and moral dimensions of the conflict. They could use powerful symbols and stories from the Bible to inspire and motivate their followers. When speaking to a more skeptical audience, they had to be more careful. They needed to provide detailed arguments and evidence to support their claims that the war was both just and necessary. The imbalance in these sources is a reflection of the complex and often contradictory nature of religious and political discourse during times of war. The Soldier's Pocket Bible, distributed during the English Civil War, is a perfect example. This small, portable book was intended to provide guidance and comfort to soldiers in the field. It barely mentioned the New Testament or Christ, focusing instead on the practical aspects of just conduct in battle. The lack of a clear justification for the war itself was likely intentional. On the battlefield, soldiers needed to believe that their cause was righteous, that God was on their side, and that they would be protected in life and death. The flags carried into battle were another powerful symbol of the fusion of holiness and justice. Many of these flags featured images and slogans that directly appealed to both concepts. They served as a constant reminder to the soldiers of the divine mission they were undertaking and the righteousness of their cause. In the end, the use of theological concepts to justify war was not a simple or straightforward matter. It was a complex interplay of religious belief, political necessity, and social pressure. For William and the other soldiers in the village, the words of Father Thomas and the symbols around them provided a sense of purpose and meaning in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and uncertain. As the sun began to rise, casting a faint light over the village, William took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever lay ahead, his faith and his sword his only guides.